The wind howled through the Rocky Mountains of Colorado with a violence that seemed intent on erasing all traces of human presence. Daniel Bryant, a 38-year-old wildlife biologist from Boulder, had been tracking elk migration patterns through the backcountry near the Continental Divide when the blizzard struck without warning. The storm descended with such ferocity that visibility dropped to near zero within minutes. Disoriented and desperate for shelter, Daniel spotted a dark opening in the mountainside, a cave entrance partially obscured by snow-laden pine branches. He stumbled inside, his body already shaking from the cold, frost forming on his beard. The cave stretched deeper into the mountain than he had anticipated, and as he moved further in to escape the wind's brutal assault, he heard a sound that chilled him more than the temperature ever could, a deep, ominous crack followed by the thunderous roar of collapsing rock. The entrance behind him gave way, tons of limestone and granite sealing him inside complete darkness. Daniel fumbled for his headlamp, his fingers clumsy with cold, and when the beam finally cut through the blackness, his heart sank. The passage back was completely blocked. He was trapped. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. His immediate inventory was grim. His backpack contained basic field equipment, a notebook, GPS unit now useless underground, a water bottle half frozen, 3 energy bars, a lighter, a small knife, and a compact first aid kit. His phone had no signal and would be dead within hours. The temperature inside the cave hovered around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, above freezing but cold enough to kill through hypothermia if he couldn't generate heat. Daniel's training as a biologist had taught him about animal physiology and survival, but nothing had prepared him for this. He had perhaps 72 hours before his body would begin to shut down without proper warmth and sustenance. The first night was a test of will. Daniel gathered what dry material he could find near the cave's interior, bits of driftwood that had washed in during some ancient flood, dead roots protruding from cracks in the ceiling, fragments of bark. He built a small fire using his lighter, nursing the flames with trembling hands. The warmth was immediate and merciful, pushing back the deadly cold that had been settling into his bones. But as he watched the flames consume his meager fuel supply, a terrible realization set in. He had perhaps enough combustible material for 3, maybe 4 more fires. After that, he would be at the mercy of the freezing darkness. As the fire burned low that first night, Daniel's headlamp beam swept across something that made him pause. Scattered throughout the cave floor were bones, animal bones of various sizes, some ancient and others more recent. He recognized the remains of deer, elk, perhaps a mountain lion that had used this cave as a den at some point. There were skulls picked clean by scavengers, leg bones, ribs, vertebrae. Daniel's mind raced back to a graduate seminar he had attended years ago on prehistoric human behavior. The professor had mentioned archaeological evidence of ancient peoples using animal bones as fuel in treeless regions. Bones contained fat, particularly marrow, and that fat could burn. The idea seemed desperate, almost medieval, but Daniel was facing a medieval situation. He reached for a deer femur, feeling its weight in his hand. The bone was old but substantial. Using a flat rock as a surface, he struck the bone with another rock, trying to crack it open. The first attempts were futile, but eventually the bone split, revealing the hollow center where marrow had once been. He added the broken bones to his dwindling fire along with the last of his wood, watching with scientific curiosity and desperate hope. The bones took time to catch, requiring sustained heat before they began to contribute to the flames. But when they did, they produced a steady, if acrid, smoke and generated surprising warmth. The fat content, even in these old specimens, was enough to sustain combustion. Daniel allowed himself the smallest measure of hope. He had found a way to keep the fire burning. The next morning, If it could be called morning in the timeless darkness of his prison, Daniel's situation had crystallized into a stark reality. The cave-in had been complete and massive. No amount of digging with his bare hands would break through tons of collapsed rock. His only chance was rescue. But who would even know where to look? He had told his research partner, Victoria, that he would be back by evening, but that had been before the storm. Search and rescue teams would be grounded in this weather, and even if they could fly, the cave entrance was now invisible under snow and rubble. He could be here for days, possibly weeks. His body's needs became the central focus of each hour. The cold was relentless, seeping up from the stone floor and down from the cave ceiling. Daniel knew hypothermia would be his greatest enemy, far more dangerous than hunger in the short term. He had read about the stages: shivering, confusion, loss of coordination, eventual unconsciousness, and death. The fire was his lifeline, and the bones scattered throughout the cave were his fuel supply. He began systematically collecting every bone he could find, creating a stockpile near his fire pit. Some were small, rodent bones, bird remains. Others were substantial: elk ribs, deer legs, what appeared to be the partial skeleton of a mountain sheep. The process of using bones as fuel became ritualistic and time-consuming. Unlike wood, bones required preparation. Daniel would crack them open to expose the marrow cavity, increasing their surface area and fat content accessibility. He learned through trial and error that bones burned best when placed in a bed of hot coals, rather than introduced to fresh flames. The combustion was slow but steady, producing heat that radiated out in the enclosed space. The smoke was thick and sometimes noxious, forcing him to move back from the fire to avoid inhaling too much, but it was warmth, and warmth meant survival. By the third day, Daniel's energy bars were gone. Hunger gnawed at his stomach with increasing insistence, but he knew from his biological training that the human body could survive weeks without food if it had water. The cave provided that at least. Moisture condensed on the walls and dripped from stalactites, which he collected in his water bottle. It tasted of minerals and stone, but it was clean and cold and kept him hydrated. His body was already beginning to consume its own fat reserves for energy, and he could feel the weakness creeping into his limbs. But as long as he had fire, he had a chance. The isolation was perhaps as dangerous as the physical threats. In the flickering light of the bone fire, Daniel's mind wandered through memories and regrets. He thought of his daughter, Lily, who was 7 years old and lived with his ex-wife in Denver. He had missed her last birthday because of a research trip. He thought of his mother, who had begged him to choose a safer career. He thought of all the small moments he had taken for granted: sunlight on his face, the taste of hot coffee, the simple freedom of walking out a door. The cave became both his prison and his church, a place of physical survival and mental reckoning. On the 5th day, Daniel heard something that made his heart leap, a faint rumbling from somewhere deep in the cave system. Was it another collapse? Was the entire mountain coming down on him? He grabbed his headlamp and moved cautiously toward the sound, his body weak from lack of food but still mobile. The cave extended further back than he had explored, narrowing into passages that required him to crawl. The sound grew louder, and then he saw it, a thin stream of water flowing through a crack in the rock, fed by snowmelt from above. The storm had ended, and the mountain was beginning to thaw. More importantly, the water's path suggested a connection to the surface. It was a glimmer of possibility, but not yet a solution. He was still trapped, still burning bones to stay alive, still waiting for rescue that might never come. The next week blurred into a cycle of fire-tending, water-collecting, and the endless battle against hypothermia and despair. Daniel's body was consuming itself, burning muscle mass for energy. His jeans hung loose on his hips, and his face had become gaunt, the skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. He rationed his movements to conserve energy, spending most of his time huddled near the fire, adding bones methodically to keep the flames alive. The stockpile of fuel was diminishing, and he had begun to venture deeper into the cave system, searching for more remains. Each expedition left him weaker, but each bone collected was another hour of warmth, another increment of survival. His mind played tricks in the darkness. He had conversations with people who weren't there, heard voices echoing through the stone chambers. Once, he could have sworn he heard helicopters overhead, the thump of rotors beating against the mountain air. But when he shouted until his voice went hoarse, no response came. It might have been real, or it might have been his oxygen-starved brain creating false hope. The line between reality and hallucination was becoming dangerously thin. On the 14th day, Daniel made a decision that probably saved his life. He began carving messages into the cave wall using a sharp piece of stone. He documented his name, the date he entered the cave, his daughter's name, his mother's contact information. If he died here, at least there would be a record, a message in a bottle from beyond the grave. But the act of carving, the physical effort and mental focus required, pulled him back from the edge of giving up. Each letter chipped into the limestone was an act of defiance against the mountain that held him captive. The fire kept burning, the bones kept turning to ash and ember. Daniel's world had contracted to a 10-foot radius around the flames, a sphere of orange light in an ocean of darkness. He had lost track of day and night, measuring time only in the number of bones consumed and the slow weakening of his body. His beard had grown wild and matted, his clothes were filthy with ash and smoke, and his hands were cut and bruised from handling sharp bones and rough stone. But his eyes, sunken in their sockets, still held a spark of determination. He would not die in this cave. He would not let the mountain win. On day 16, Daniel found something that changed everything. While exploring a narrow side passage in search of more bones, his headlamp illuminated a section of wall that felt different, cooler, with a subtle movement of air. He pressed his face close to the stone and felt it distinctly. A breeze, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere beyond the rock. There was an opening, or at least a crack, that connected to the outside world. His heart pounded with renewed hope. If air could pass through, maybe sound could too. Maybe light. Maybe rescue. He returned to his fire pit and retrieved the one item he had been saving, a small emergency whistle attached to his backpack's sternum strap. The whistle's shrill call was designed to carry over long distances and penetrate through wind and weather. Daniel positioned himself at the crack in the wall and began to blow, long, steady blasts, pausing to listen, then blowing again. 1 whistle, 2, 10, 100. His lips became chapped and bleeding from the effort, his lungs burning, but he kept blowing. Hours passed. Nothing. But he didn't stop. The whistle was his voice, his message to the world beyond the stone. Someone had to hear it. They had to. The rescue teams had been searching for Daniel Bryant for 17 days when they finally caught a break. Victoria Ramirez, his research partner, had refused to give up hope even when the official search had been scaled back. She had spent her own money hiring a private search and rescue consultant, a man named Robert Harrison, a veteran mountaineer who specialized in impossible recoveries. Harrison had studied the topography, the storm patterns, the likely routes Daniel might have taken. He had narrowed the search area to a 3-square-mile section of the Continental Divide. On the 17th day, Harrison's team was working the southern face of a ridge when one of the volunteers, a young paramedic named Jake Foster, thought he heard something. The rest of the team was skeptical. Wind in the rocks often created eerie sounds, but Foster insisted. They stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped breathing, and listened. There it was again, a high-pitched rhythmic sound, almost like a bird's call, but too regular, too insistent. It was a whistle, and it was coming from somewhere inside the mountain. The team scrambled over the snow-covered slope, following the sound to a collapsed section of mountainside where an avalanche or rock slide had recently occurred. The whistle sound was louder here, emanating from somewhere beneath the rubble. Harrison immediately called for additional resources, specialized cave rescue teams, heavy equipment, structural engineers. This wasn't a simple extraction. This was a major recovery operation that would require coordination, expertise, and no small amount of luck. Inside the cave, Daniel had no idea that his signal had been heard. He had been blowing the whistle in shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours resting, for the past 20 hours. His lips were so damaged that every breath through the whistle sent sharp pain through his face, but he couldn't stop. It was all he had left, his last act of resistance against the void. The fire beside him had burned down to coals, the bone pile nearly depleted. He was entering the final stage of his ordeal, one way or another. When the first sounds of heavy machinery reached him through the stone, Daniel thought he was hallucinating again. But then came voices, muffled but definitely human, and the unmistakable sound of rocks being moved, shifted, hauled away. They had found him. Rescue was coming. Daniel tried to shout, but his voice had been reduced to a hoarse whisper from dehydration and whistle-blowing. He grabbed a rock and began striking it against the wall, creating a rhythmic pounding that echoed through the cave system. The pounding from outside answered back. They heard him. They knew he was alive. They were coming. The extraction took another 7 hours. The rescue team had to carefully remove tons of debris while ensuring they didn't trigger another collapse that would bury Daniel permanently. They drilled a small bore hole first, threading through a camera to locate him and assess his condition. When the lens finally penetrated into the cave chamber, the image it transmitted back to the surface stunned the rescue team. They saw a skeletal figure huddled beside a small fire, surrounded by ash and bones, looking more like a prehistoric cave dweller than a 21st century scientist. But he was alive, and he was conscious, and he was looking directly into the camera with eyes that still held intelligence and awareness. Dr. Lisa Kimura, the medical lead for the rescue operation, spoke to Daniel through a communication line threaded through the borehole. Her voice, the first human voice he had heard in over 2 weeks, nearly broke him. "Daniel, my name is Lisa. We're going to get you out of there. Can you hear me?" He managed to rasp out a response, his voice cracking with emotion. "Yes, I can hear you. Thank you. Thank you." Kimura quickly assessed his condition through questions and the camera feed. He was severely dehydrated, malnourished, hypothermic, and likely suffering from acute stress reaction, but his vitals seemed stable enough for extraction. They passed supplies through the borehole: water, electrolyte solutions, thermal blankets, a proper flashlight. Daniel drank the water in small, careful sips, following Kimura's instructions precisely. Too much too fast would shock his system. The thermal blanket felt like luxury beyond description, wrapping his shivering body in artificial warmth. But the most important thing they sent through was hope. He was no longer alone. The mountain had not won. At 4:47 p.m. on the 24th day of his entrapment, the rescue team broke through the final barrier. A shaft of daylight, the first Daniel had seen in over 3 weeks, pierced the darkness of his cave prison. He shielded his eyes against the brightness, tears streaming down his filthy cheeks. Hands reached through the opening, strong hands belonging to Harrison and Foster, lifting him carefully through the debris field and into the alpine air. The sunlight was overwhelming, the cold breeze intoxicating, the sight of human faces the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. They placed him on a stretcher and began the careful descent from the mountain. An air ambulance waited in a clearing below, its rotors already spinning. Daniel looked back at the cave entrance as they carried him away, at the dark mouth in the stone that had been his world for 24 days. Inside that darkness, a small fire still burned, fueled by the last bones in his pile, a testament to the human will to survive against impossible odds. The media coverage of Daniel Bryant's rescue was extensive. It had everything: a scientist trapped in a frozen cave, a desperate fight for survival, an innovative use of animal bones as fuel, and a dramatic rescue operation involving dozens of volunteers and professionals. Network news anchored their evening broadcasts with his story, and within days, he became known as the Cave Survivor, or the Bonefire Man. But for Daniel, the attention was overwhelming and unwanted. He had no interest in being a symbol or a headline. He simply wanted to see his daughter. The hospital in Denver kept him for 2 weeks. He had lost 43 pounds, suffered from severe malnutrition, mild frostbite on 3 toes, and significant psychological trauma. The physical recovery was straightforward: calories, vitamins, warmth, and time. The mental recovery would take much longer. He woke screaming from nightmares of being buried alive, of watching his fire go out, of freezing to death alone in the dark. The hospital's trauma counselor, Dr. Patricia Okafor, worked with him daily, helping him process the experience and develop coping mechanisms. Victoria visited every day, bringing him books, his laptop, updates from the research project. She felt tremendous guilt for not insisting on delaying the fieldwork until the weather cleared, but Daniel wouldn't hear it. "I made the choices," he told her. "I saw the storm coming and pushed forward anyway. This isn't on you." But they both knew their relationship had changed. The easy camaraderie of field work had been replaced by something more weighted, more careful. They had looked into the abyss together, from different sides of the mountain. On the 14th day of his hospital stay, Daniel's ex-wife, Catherine, brought Lily to visit. The little girl stood in the doorway of his hospital room, uncertain and frightened by her father's gaunt appearance. Daniel held out his arms, and after a moment's hesitation, she ran to him, burying her face in his shoulder. He held her with a fierceness that made his healing ribs ache, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her small body against his chest. This was what he had survived for, this moment, this person. "Daddy, you look like a skeleton," Lily said with the brutal honesty of childhood. Daniel laughed, the first genuine laugh in weeks. "I know, sweetheart. But I'm getting better. I'm going to be okay." Catherine stood by the door, her arms crossed, tears in her eyes. She had always been afraid of his fieldwork, the risks he took in pursuit of his research. Now her fears had been validated in the most traumatic way possible. "I'm glad you're alive," she said simply. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't an invitation back into her life, but it was acknowledgement. And that was enough. The question everyone wanted answered was how he had survived so long with minimal supplies. The bone-burning technique fascinated anthropologists, archaeologists, and survival experts. Daniel gave one press conference at the urging of the university's public relations department, explaining the science behind it. "Bones contain fat, primarily in the marrow," he explained to the assembled reporters. "When subjected to sustained heat, that fat liquefies and becomes combustible. Ancient peoples in treeless regions used this technique regularly. I simply remembered what I had learned and applied it to my situation." What he didn't tell them, what he couldn't put into words for public consumption, was the psychological aspect of the fire. It wasn't just warmth, it was company, purpose, hope. Tending the fire gave him a reason to move, to think, to plan. Every bone placed on the flames was an act of defiance against death. The fire became his companion in the darkness, the one constant in a world that had been reduced to stone and cold and isolation. When he stared into those flames, fed by the bones of dead animals, he was staring at the line between existence and extinction, and he had kept that line burning for 24 days. 3 months after his rescue, Daniel returned to the cave. It wasn't a decision he made lightly, and both his therapist and his mother advised against it, but he needed to close the circle. Harrison, the rescue coordinator who had found him, agreed to accompany him, along with a proper caving team, safety equipment, and emergency protocols. The entrance had been partially reopened by the rescue operation and then secured with metal grating to prevent accidents. They obtained permission from the Forest Service to enter. Descending back into the darkness required every ounce of Daniel's courage. His hands shook as he clipped into the safety line. His breathing became rapid and shallow as they moved past the former collapse zone, now shored up with metal supports. But he pushed forward, Harrison staying close beside him, until they reached the chamber where he had spent 24 days. The space looked smaller than he remembered. The fire pit was still there, a circle of scorched stone, surrounded by ash and bone fragments. His messages carved into the wall were still visible, weathered but legible. The crack through which air had flowed, through which he had blown his whistle for hours, was barely wider than his finger, yet it had been his salvation. Daniel stood in the center of the chamber, his headlamp casting shadows on the walls, and felt the weight of those days settle over him again. "How did you keep from losing your mind?" Harrison asked quietly. It was the first time anyone had asked the question so directly. Daniel thought for a long moment before answering. "I gave myself tasks: collect bones, maintain the fire, carve messages, count days. Each task was a small victory over the situation, and I talked to people who weren't there, my daughter, my mother, even my college roommate. I narrated my actions out loud, like I was hosting a nature documentary. It sounds crazy, but it kept me connected to the world outside." They didn't stay long. The cave had given up its hold on Daniel, but it still carried the echo of his ordeal, and he had no desire to linger. As they made their way back to the surface, Daniel felt something release in his chest, not quite closure, but at least acknowledgement. He had faced the worst the mountain could offer and had survived. Not through superhuman strength or special skills, but through stubbornness, creativity, and the fundamental human refusal to surrender. A year later, Daniel published a paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science about the use of animal bones as fuel, drawing on both historical research and his personal experience. The paper became widely cited in survival literature and anthropological studies. He received invitations to speak at conferences, to appear on survival television shows, to write a book about his experience. He declined most of them, accepting only opportunities that felt meaningful rather than exploitative. His relationship with his daughter deepened in ways he hadn't expected. The experience had stripped away his tendency to prioritize work over family. He cut back his field time, took a teaching position at the university that kept him closer to Denver, and made every one of Lily's soccer games and school performances. Catherine remarked that he had become a different person, quieter, more present, less driven by the need to prove himself. "Nearly dying changes you," he replied simply. The nightmares became less frequent, though they never entirely disappeared. Sometimes, in moments of stress or during winter storms, Daniel would feel the phantom cold of the cave seeping into his bones, would smell the acrid smoke of burning marrow, would hear the silence of stone walls closing in. But he had developed tools to manage the trauma, and slowly, incrementally, he reclaimed his life from the shadow of those 24 days. Robert Harrison became an unexpected friend. They met quarterly for coffee, two men who had shared an extraordinary moment, one trapped beneath a mountain, one orchestrating the rescue. Harrison told stories of other recoveries he had led, the successes and the failures, the weight of holding someone's life in your decisions. Daniel told stories of his research, of elk behavior and migration patterns, of the beauty and danger of wilderness. They didn't talk about the cave much. They didn't need to. It was there between them, understood and acknowledged without being given too much power. On the second anniversary of his rescue, Daniel hiked back to the ridge above the cave, this time alone. The mountain was calm that day, the weather clear, the sky a brilliant alpine blue. He carried a small bronze plaque, which he mounted on a boulder overlooking the collapse site. The inscription was simple: in memory of the will to survive. May all who venture into these mountains respect their power and return safely home. He stood for a moment in silence, one hand resting on the cold bronze, then turned and began the hike back down. The story of the man who endured 24 days inside a frozen cave, kept alive by burning animal bones, became part of Colorado's folklore. Hikers would point to the ridge and tell the tale to their companions. Survival instructors used his experience as a teaching tool. Search and rescue teams studied the operation's coordination and execution, but for Daniel Bryant, the story was more personal and less dramatic than the public version. It was about choices made in extremity, about the small actions that add up to survival, about the profound gratitude for ordinary moments that most people take for granted. He never lost his love for the mountains, never stopped his research into wildlife behavior, never gave up the work that had defined his adult life. But he approached it differently now, with more caution and more humility. The mountains had taught him a lesson in that frozen cave, not about his strength or resilience, but about his fragility, his luck, and the thin line that separates a routine field trip from a life-or-death ordeal. He had crossed that line and made it back, carrying with him the knowledge that survival is never guaranteed, never deserved, but sometimes through a combination of preparation, improvisation, and sheer stubborn refusal to quit, it can be achieved. The fire had kept him alive, a fire fed by the bones of animals that had themselves once fought for survival in these same mountains. There was a symmetry to that, a connection across species and time that Daniel found profoundly moving. In the darkest hours of his captivity, when the cold pressed in and the darkness seemed absolute, that fire had been more than heat. It had been hope made visible, determination made tangible, life refusing to be extinguished. And in the end, that had been enough.